For decades, these men stood for television fatherhood, authority, safety, and the polished fantasy of family life. But off-camera, several were reportedly hiding far more complicated realities. Secrecy, pressure, rumor, managed publicity, political danger, loneliness, and the exhausting cost of surviving an era that punished honesty. Some stories are well documented. Others remain blurred by silence, shame, or records that never surfaced. Either way, the image was simple. The men were not. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Robert Reed. On the Brady Bunch, he was the ideal American dad, composed, handsome, reassuring, and permanently in control. Mike Brady looked like the kind of father television wanted to mass produce. But Reed himself reportedly felt trapped by that image. Before Brady, he had built a stronger dramatic reputation on The Defenders, and he often clashed with Brady creator Sherwood Schwartz because he thought the sitcom scripts were too sugary and unrealistic. That tension matters because the role that made him immortal was also the role that most tightly sealed him inside a fantasy. Off-screen, Reed kept his sexuality private in a period when exposure could wreck a mainstream career. Co-stars later said people around the show understood more than the public did, but Reed did not openly discuss it. Florence Henderson later described him as deeply unhappy and suggested that the strain of living a double life fed some of his anger and frustration. Even in 2026, Eve Plum said she had never known he was gay, which shows how total that compartmentalization could be. That makes his on-set perfection look different. It was not just performance, it may have been survival. And the ending makes the contradiction even harsher. Reed died in 1992 at 59 from colon lymphoma, with HIV listed as a contributing factor on his death certificate after details became public. The media treatment of that revelation added another layer of cruelty to a life already built around concealment. America remembered Mike Brady as effortless. Robert Reed, by contrast, seems to have spent years carrying the cost of being convincing, polished, and protectively unreadable. Raymond Burr. He projected authority so completely that audiences trusted him on sight. As Perry Mason, and later as Ironside, he did not play fatherhood in the suburban sense, but he absolutely played masculine certainty. He looked like command itself. That made his private life especially guarded. During his career, Burr told stories about marriages and a son who died young, but after his death, journalists found major parts of that history difficult or impossible to verify. What remained was a public persona so tightly managed that even the gaps became part of the story. There was, however, one relationship that stands on much firmer ground. Burr and actor Robert Benavides met on Perry Mason in 1960 and remained together for decades, building businesses and a life that stayed largely outside the official public image. Burr never openly identified as gay while he was alive, and he was famously resistant to discussing his private life at all. That reserve was not unusual for the era, but in his case, it became almost architectural. He seemed to build walls, then decorate them with myth. That is why Burr feels less like a gossip item and more like a case study in image control. Here was one of television's great symbols of confidence, dignity, and courtroom truth, yet his own truth remained compartmentalized until after death. The system rewarded authority on screen, but often demanded silence off it. Burr mastered that bargain so well that the performance outlived the man. Sebastian Cabot. He brought elegance to television. On Family Affair, as Giles French, he was the polished, gentle caretaker who made upper-class order feel warm instead of cold. His voice alone sounded civilized, but Cabot's off-screen life remains one of the murkier chapters on this list. Unlike some others here, there was no late-life public confession, no widely discussed turning point, no posthumous avalanche of confirmed detail. What survives instead is a quieter pattern: reserve, distance, and years of off-screen speculation that never fully hardened into proof. That ambiguity matters. In old Hollywood and old television, silence could function like a second press agent. If a man stayed formal enough, gracious enough, and private enough, questions could hover forever without landing. Cabot's cultural image benefited from that polish. So did the industry around him too. And that leaves a strange aftertaste. The man who seemed to make domestic life feel safe and orderly now reads less like a solved story than a sealed one. With Cabot, the contradiction is not revelation. It is how completely a life can disappear behind good manners. Lynde. He may be the most complicated figure here because he was both visible and hidden at the same time. Audiences knew the voice, the sneer, the camp timing, the wicked one-liners on Hollywood squares, and the unforgettable chaos he brought to Bewitched and Bye Bye Birdie. He was funny in a way that felt unmistakable, and yet the culture still demanded that unmistakability never be named too plainly. His persona could flirt with recognition, but his actual life remained boxed in by euphemism, innuendo, and industry cowardice. Friends and biographers have said that hiding his sexuality frustrated him. During his lifetime, mainstream coverage only hinted. A 1976 People profile referred to Stan Finesmith in coded terms so obvious they almost became their own kind of denial. Meanwhile, Lynde's off-screen life grew darker. He struggled with alcohol, endured professional instability, and carried a reputation for volatility that complicated the laughter people associated with him. In 1965, a young man named James Davidson died after falling from Lynde's hotel window, an incident that generated lurid attention without ever becoming a murder case. The public remembered the scandal. It understood less about the loneliness around it. That is what makes Lynde so sad. He could be the punchline, the tease, the center square, the comic release, but not fully himself. He turned coded performance into a career because direct honesty still came with penalties. When an era lets a man be legible but not livable, the applause starts sounding cruel. Beneath the barbs and laughs, there was reportedly a man whose wit often had to do the emotional hiding for him. Hugh Beaumont. He was Ward Cleaver, one of the cleanest symbols of television fatherhood ever created. Calm voice, moral certainty, pressed shirts. On Leave It to Beaver, he did not just play a father. He helped define the visual language of respectable American manhood. Off-screen, though, the picture was more complicated in ways that do not lead to one neat conclusion. Beaumont had studied theology, was known as an ordained Methodist minister, directed episodes of the show, later wrote scripts, and left acting for a quieter life in Minnesota. That grounded, conventional image is exactly why later speculation around his private life has lingered. But in Beaumont's case, the proof remains debated, thin, or absent, depending on the claim. What is firmly documented is strain of another kind. A family car accident in 1959 killed his mother-in-law and severely injured his son, and Jerry Mathers later said the tragedy deeply affected Beaumont's work. So his chapter has to be handled differently, not as revelation, but as uncertainty. The larger point is that classic television kept rewarding fatherly steadiness while discouraging messier truth, whether emotional, familial, or personal. Beaumont sold serenity for years. The real man disappears the moment certainty begins. Geer. He gave audiences one of television's warmest elder figures as Grandpa Zeb Walton. He felt earthy, wise, and trustworthy, the kind of man who seemed rooted in hearth, soil, and decency. But Geer's real life had much wider political and personal stakes than that comforting image suggested. Long before the Waltons, he was involved in labor activism, associated with left-wing organizing, and was blacklisted in the 1950s after refusing to cooperate with congressional anti-communist pressure. That alone turns his later grandfatherly image into something more defiant than nostalgic. His private life was unconventional too. Biographical sources connect him romantically to Harry Hay, who later co-founded the Mattachine Society, one of the first sustained gay rights organizations in the United States. Geer also married actress Herta Ware and had children, so his life resists simple labeling. but it clearly did not fit the neat television template. He moved through radical politics, queer-adjacent history, and blacklist punishment, then re-entered mainstream America as one of its most beloved old men. That is what gives his story unusual historical weight. For some men on this list, secrecy was mainly personal. For Geer, the pressure came from multiple directions at once: sex, politics, reputation, and employability. He was not just hiding from gossip. He was surviving systems that could erase livelihoods. So when audiences embraced Grandpa Walton as wholesome Americana, they were also embracing a man whose actual life had already collided with some of the century's harshest machinery of conformity. Robert Young. He may have embodied television reassurance even more completely than some of the openly paternal stars here. Between Father Knows Best and Marcus Welby, MD, he became the face of patient masculinity, reason, and benevolent authority. He looked like a man who had figured life out. But that image was deeply misleading. Young later spoke openly about depression and alcoholism, and in 1991, he survived a suicide attempt. Britannica notes that the man who played calm for America had suffered for years. That is not the same kind of hidden life as a closeted relationship or a concealed partner, but it belongs in the same emotional landscape. The industry sold viewers a fantasy of stable manhood while rewarding performers for suppressing whatever might disrupt it. In Young's case, the hidden burden was mental anguish. There were also later whispers and biographical suggestions around off-screen tensions, but the documented reality is already painful enough without exaggeration. So his chapter lands differently. It asks what television did to men who became symbols of balance they could not personally sustain. Young's tragedy is not just that he suffered, it is that millions trusted him as proof that suffering could be mastered by good posture, a soft voice, and a weekly moral lesson. Dick Sargent. He is one of the clearest cases on this list because the story finally broke into daylight while he was still alive. Television viewers knew him as the second Darren Stevens on Bewitched, a familiar sitcom husband inside one of TV's safest fantasy worlds. He had the polished, mildly exasperated face of network normalcy. But normalcy was exactly the costume. For years, Sargent reportedly feared exposure in an industry that could still punish gay actors professionally and socially, especially those expected to play straight, romantic leads. Then, in 1991, on National Coming Out Day, he publicly came out as gay. He later said concern about suicide among young gay people pushed him to do it, and he jokingly called himself a retroactive role model. That phrase is funny, but it also hurts. It suggests a man looking back at decades of concealment and trying to make something useful out of the silence. In 1992, he and Elizabeth Montgomery served as grand marshals of the Los Angeles Gay Pride Parade, turning a former sitcom marriage into a public act of solidarity. That late turn gives his chapter a different energy from the others. Sargent did not simply leave behind rumors for biographers to decode. He crossed the line himself and spoke. But the timing tells its own sad story. He died in 1994, only a few years after coming out. Visibility finally arrived, but late. The husband millions recognized from prime time spent much of his real life waiting for the culture to become survivable. William Frawley. He is usually remembered as pure television texture, gruff, funny, cranky, and impossible to mistake. On My Three Sons, as Bubbo Casey, he brought an older male presence that felt rougher than the clean suburban fathers around him. But off-screen, the mood was much less lovable. Frawley had a long history of heavy drinking, a reputation for being difficult, and a professional life shaped as much by endurance as affection. By the time television made him familiar, he was already carrying the wear of vaudeville, divorce, and years of hard living. This is also one of the most uncertain cases in the lineup. Long-running rumors have floated around Frawley's private life, but hard proof is scarce, and biographical certainty remains elusive. What is better documented is isolation. His public feuds, especially the well-known tension with Vivian Vance on I Love Lucy, fed an image of a man who could entertain America while seeming increasingly alone inside the business. That makes his final impression especially bleak. He could still play family-adjacent warmth on screen, but the off-screen picture feels colder, angrier, and more solitary. With Frawley, the haunting note is not revelation. It is erosion. Even the laughs now sound a little tired. These men helped sell America its dream of fatherhood. The question is darker now. How much life, truth, and dignity did television demand they sacrifice to keep that dream intact? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories.